What is a quarterback worth to a spread? Now, we should note for our audience, Will, a quarterback is not worth anything to a spread. It is the difference between him and his backup. So as we see here on our list, number 16, Caleb Williams, worth about 3.98 points to the spread. We'll round it up to 4, considering his backup, Tyson Bagent, and Williams is highly respected, but you're only as good as the guy behind you. So I always make the comparison. If Patrick Mahomes was backed up by Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes went out for the rest of the season, you wouldn't move the spread at all because Tom Brady's awesome. It's always what your backup is in comparison to you, but we could still see here that Mahomes to Carson Wentz, the biggest difference by some odds makers, a 7.5-point difference on average, according to some of these odds makers, that Mahomes would be worth if he went down and Carson Wentz took over. But what do you make of this? And when you look at the top 4, Patrick Mahomes, 7.5. Josh Allen to Mitchell Trubisky, about a 7-point difference. Lamar Jackson to Josh Johnson, about a 6.8, 7-point difference. And Justin Herbert making it in over Easton Stick, just about a 6-point difference between those two. Jordan Love checks in at number 5, down to Sean Clifford. But your top 5, any shocks there for you?
I think my big takeaway is I'm reminded of who the backups are in some of these spots. Like I had known, once I see Wentz is on the Chiefs, okay, yeah, I remember that. But if you'd asked me, an hour ago who the backup for Mahomes is, is it still Chad Henne? Is it still Blaine Gabbert? I'm not sure I would have gotten it right away. The Dobbs in San Francisco was one. Again, I remember hearing it now that I see it, but I'd forgotten. So it's important when you're handicapping these teams. It's ultra important if you're betting preseason football. Just so much of it is the quarterback rotation where these starters play very little. So know the backups. I think the general thing, though, the general takeaway, and most people probably look at this and say the top quarterbacks, there should be a bigger number between like, oh my God, it's only a difference of a touchdown when Mahomes gets hurt. It's only 1 touchdown in the entire game. Herbert to Easton Stick's only less than a touchdown. So I think that's just the natural, and look, these odds makers, I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying I think most people look at it, and if you ask them to make a difference between Mahomes and Wentz, they'd probably say like 2 touchdowns. Not that that's the correct number either, but I don't know. I think looking at it, some of the top players, the gap isn't as big as you'd expect. Is that a fair way of putting it, you think?
Yeah, I think I'm smelling what you're stepping in for the most part when you're talking about some of these numbers and these differences. I think for me, what is pretty fascinating is I'd make the argument that Carson Wentz is more adequate than what we're looking at here, right? A difference of 7.5 between Mahomes and Carson Wentz. And let's face it, this is not a Mahomes is the system. But in a system that does help raise the floor of quarterbacks. I mean, we've seen time and again guys step in for the Kansas City Chiefs under Andy Reid and perform adequately. I think that should be considered. For what I'll point out one thing to you. I bet him for MVP. I think you were in on this as well. I think Jared Goff deserves a little bit more respect here in this. You know what I'm talking about? Like if we're rolling again, and these are just averages and differences between Jared Goff and his backup, and all these starters. To tell me that the difference between Jared Goff and Hendon Hooker, a guy we have not seen out there on this field, I think that is a difference that is much larger than what you would think. And I think this kind of goes in the order that you expect. But if I'm honestly evaluating some of these backups, let's go Jalen Hurts and Kenny Pickett, for example. I watched Kenny Pickett play football. I watched Jalen Hurts play football. I think that gap is much larger than just 5.5 points between those two, kind of to your point. So my shock is more, I think we should see some of these, I guess we'll call them lesser quarterbacks, near the top, because I think the gap between them and their backup is a cavern, as opposed to what you're talking about for like Mahomes and Allen to Wentz and Trubisky, 2 guys who've at least had strong seasons in the National Football League.
Lamar Jackson, 6.78 over Josh Johnson. Is that the Josh Johnson for which I am familiar? Is that the 40-year-old guy who's played on like 27 different teams?
Like every single team?
Yeah, again, that feels a little short, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just a little square with it where I look at it and say, man, the top quarterbacks, there should be a bigger gap. I agree with the Goff one. And I think even if you ask these odds makers, they probably admit, they'd probably tell you, you know what, I feel pretty good about my number on Mahomes and Herbert and Lamar. It's probably very difficult for them to put a number on Hendon Hooker we haven't seen, or Sean Clifford, who we've seen little of, or Easton. What are you going on? You're going on probably a composite of, I think there's a lot of just perception. Then you add in college stats, then you add in what they've done in the preseason, whatever limited snaps they've had in the NFL, which for a lot of these guys is not much. So it's there's some guesswork, I think, in there.
I mean, so we can go to the bottom of the list too, but I think that like that's spot on, because you don't really know what you're going with some of these guys when you're talking about it. But it is kind of like a guess, right? When you look at some of these differences, and like for example, what's going to be fascinating is let's if we throw this up. So like Number 21 and 22 are fascinating, okay? And for those who are just joining us, we're going over article at CBS Sports going over the differentials in starting quarterback to backups in the National Football League, essentially what a quarterback is worth to a spread. Deshaun Watson, that's fascinating because if 2020 Deshaun Watson shows up, he's going to vault to the top of the list, right? He's going to be one of the more valuable quarterbacks in the National Football League because we've seen him play. I would argue Geno Smith to Sam Howell is worth more than a field goal, and yet right now you're looking at underneath a field goal difference between those two. Geno Smith deserves way more credit for what he's done here. And so again, these are just like guesstimates and averages and whatnot, and nothing is perfect to your point. But like when you talk about a difference between Geno Smith and Sam Howell, or for me, Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell are the same guy. There is no statistical difference between these two. They play differently, but I watched Gardner Minshew all last year. I don't think you throw those two in a hat and you pull one out and you simulate a season with both of those guys throughout the entirety of a year for the Raiders. I'm pretty sure you're probably well within striking distance of those records each time. Like those are the ones that I really quibble with. But to your point, it's not a perfect science.
And this is mean what I'm about to say, so I apologize for offending anyone. Bryce Young and Andy Dalton, there's a 1-point difference. Who's it in favor of?
No, don't do that. No, so okay. So this is go ahead.
No, I mean I know it's mean. But I don't know. I had bets on Carolina last year, and when Bryce Young got hurt, I think, or Andy Dalton came in for like a backdoor cover or tried to get like a teaser or something home, I was like, I'm okay with this. This is okay. So I mean that's the old bettor's truth here, where somebody gets hurt or somebody you really know or you really have a good feel for something when you have a bet on it, and that's the old truth serum. Like Andy Dalton comes in, you know what? I'm not too upset. I think that's not a bad situation.
I will, whatever statistical measure you want to use, I will bet Bryce Young is a top 16 quarterback this year. I'd be even willing to go higher.
I think last year was just an impossible spot. No weapons. Frank Reich, who we all consider, I mean, a lot of people considered one of the better coaches in the league not that long ago, but just kind of gone in a different direction where like his offense was just considered to be not modern, no difference makers. It was a throwaway year. I agree with that. I'm just saying, based on what we've seen, if this does not get any better for Bryce Young, I don't know if there's a big difference.
Well, and I think tying in Geno Smith, one of the reasons why I believe, look, Dave Canales has a pretty strong track record of turning these guys around. Yes. He was on the staff when Geno Smith first got there in Seattle. He's obviously was there working with Baker Mayfield. It turned that thing around. So I think that Young is, and I think some of the dancing on the grave, if you will, of Bryce Young had to do with one going first overall, but two, a lot of people are tying it to he's short. I don't think and I think Sam Monson said this on Pro Football Focus, a lot of his struggles last year were not tied to height. It was tied to the situation around him. So we'll see if
Stroud being so good made it look even worse, too.
Yep, absolutely.